Welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burke, and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. The Preservation Association of Lincoln is sponsoring today's lecture. Our speaker today is Richard Schmeling. Richard has a BA from UNL in 1962 in history and a doctorate in 1965 from the UNL College of Law. He served in Vietnam as captain in the U.S. Army Transportation Corps and has lived in Lincoln since 1958. Richard is the author of America's Shortest Interstate Railroad. He co-authored The Trains of Lincoln Station and also co-authored the trolley car era of Lincoln with Jim McKee, what he's going to talk about today. Richard also is president of Citizens for Improved Transit and District 1 representative for ProRail Nebraska. He is a lifelong student of transportation matters. His talk today is titled The Trolley Car Era in Lincoln. Please join me in welcoming Richard Schmeling.
Wow. Thank you all for coming. It's almost standing room only, although if some more people come in, I'm sure we can pull up some more chairs. I am one of the three co-authors of this book. Jim McKee, who's a noted historian here in Lincoln, was also an author, and also Mike Bartels. And I'd hoped that they could be here to share in the presentation, but if they're going to get here, they're going to get here a few minutes late, it looks like. I think a good place to start is to ask the question, why did we need streetcars here in Lincoln? And I'm going to take a little license here, and I'm going to grab a chair, and I'm going to speak sitting down, if you don't mind. I'll take the mic. Do you want me to move the microphone?
Closer, then I'll do this for you.
Well, if you want to bring a chair, you can.
Okay. Press this thing. Okay, sure.
The big question becomes, I think, why do we need to have trolley cars in Lincoln? Well, when we think back into the 1880s, which is when our first street transportation happened, our streets weren't paved. There may have been a few that were paved, but most of them were just plain dirt. And of course, the main way of getting around was you either rode your horse or you pulled your buggy or your wagon. And unfortunately, for many times of the year, because of rain and snow, the streets would be very, very muddy, and you just simply couldn't get around. So the idea was, what can we do to try to make things easier in terms of getting around the city? And of course, the city was much smaller back then. So one of the first things we did was we talked about having some sort of a system that wouldn't be subject to that muddy weather. And as a result, we ended up doing some streetcar lines. That's simply the copy of the front cover of the book. And let's go one more.
Okay.
So the first public transportation in Lincoln of a rail nature on the streets was something that we called horse cars. And we'll see horse cars here in just a minute. Go ahead and do one more. We ought to be getting, there we go. The horse cars, basically, the wagons ran on railroad rails, but they were pulled by horses or mules. And this was your first form of public transportation in Lincoln, Omaha, Nebraska City. Red Cloud even had a horse car line. And as you can see from that picture, what we did was we put some boards there next to the rails, and that was so the horses wouldn't injure their hooves if they accidentally stepped on a steel rail. Notice in the center we have some sort of, I would guess those would probably be cinders, and that was designed to keep the horses having good traction as they pulled the car along the street. One of the first lines that we that operated was a line that basically hauled luggage from the Burlington station down at 7th and N to the hotels in uptown Lincoln, and that was horse and wagon. Then we started getting the horse cars. The horse cars created some problems for the horses were limited to about 4 or 5 hours a shift, so you'd have to have, if you're going to cover a lot of hours, you're going to have a lot of horses and mules, and that meant a huge stable. It meant a big expense, but it was the best we had for a period of time. Let's go back. Eventually, what we ended up with was not horse cars, but electrically powered streetcars. This is a 1926 streetcar route map, and this shows a whole bunch of different lines. We'll talk about various ones separately, but as you can see, the lines reached out in all directions from downtown Lincoln. And of course, what we would do is, as the electric streetcars were perfected, we'd string power lines, and we would feed power to those streetcars through overhead wire. And you'll see the overhead wire in some other pictures. And just a curiosity question is, how many of you people were born in 1945 or before? Okay, so some of you who were born after 1945 may possibly have experienced the end of streetcars in Lincoln. You would have been pretty young then, and you may not remember. But the streetcar era in Lincoln lasted from essentially 1883 to 1945. Let's go back a couple. This is a picture that shows a streetcar that's at 12th and O Street. It's headed out on a run, and that building in the background is still there. That building, it was at that time it was Sartor Jewelry, which was across the street east, and now Sartor's, of course, is across the street west. That car is headed south and headed out of the downtown area. Now, in addition to the regular streetcar system in Lincoln, we had something that was called an interurban. Interurban electric railways ran from city to city, and we had one of those. And our local interurban was the Omaha, Lincoln, and Beatrice. Unfortunately, due to getting started late in the game and being underfinanced, the Omaha, Lincoln, and Beatrice never made it to Omaha and never made it to Beatrice. So
it's the green line on the map.
Yeah, and it's the green light on your map there that shows the Omaha, Lincoln, and Beatrice. OL&B came to roughly 14th and O Street using city streetcar trackage rights. They went up, clear up into Upper Bethany. There was some grading that was done east of there, headed toward Omaha, but they never built any track any further. This is, let's go back, there we go. This is at roughly 49th and Garland Street. We have the bigger car, which is coming on the OL&B from Upper Bethany, and we're picking up some passengers because the OL&B missed University Place. So what happened was they built a line along 49th and 48th Street to serve University Place, and a smaller car, which you see there, brought people from University Place down to this junction point, and then they got on the big car to go on downtown. Okay, let's do the next one. Oh, some of you will remember that. That is the former Lancaster County Courthouse. And what we see is we see a winter scene. Notice the horse and buggy parked there. Back in those days, the bulk of the transportation was horse and buggy. And notice all the hitching posts along the street there, where we have parking meters today, why they had hitching posts so you could hitch your team. This is a small car headed downtown. We're looking basically southwesterly. Lincoln had a variety of cars. Many of the cars were what we call single truck cars, and this is an example of one. They tended to be smaller. They had the advantage of being what we call a one-man car. That is, you only needed one crewman. And of course, part of the expense of transportation was paying labor. So we had some of these single truck cars. Many of them were built by a car company called Birney, and Birney also built some double truck cars, but usually these little single truck cars were known as Birney cars. Okay, anybody remember this hotel? This hotel was still in Lincoln when I came to the university in 1958, and in spite of the fact that it was pretty old, it still had good food service and it had good banquet facilities. And I can remember going to that hotel on a number of occasions and attending spring proms and fraternity sorority gatherings and so on and so forth. We are basically looking at a northwesterly direction, and that streetcar is coming down 13th Street. He's going to make this curve that we see in front of us, and then he's going to head out on his route. We have a special bonus because one of the questions that was asked was, you know, where do we get the power to run this system? Where do we get the power for the streetcars? And we have a gentleman here who worked at the power plant at K Street. And would you like to just tell us a little something about what you did at K Street?
I was retired chief engineer of Lincoln Electric System, and one of my early jobs was to manage the people in all our power plants. And at K Street, we came across a large device that I was fascinated by. It was a mercury arc rectifier. It took basically, you start with three-phase power by going delta Y and delta delta, you turn it into six-phase power, and then you go to ground and you end up with 12-phase power. Anyway, you run these 12 phases into this thing and you turn it into direct current, and it has very little ripple on it. And this provided the direct current for the traction system and also the elevators and the things of that nature downtown Lincoln. So the early started out as the Iowa Nebraska Light and Power Company, and then it became Consumers Public Power District, and they provided the direct current to all the elevators and the traction system, along with steam heat for downtown Lincoln and a lot of these things. So I ended up with the not too nice job of having to close this all down.
Oh boy. Tell us a little bit. You indicated you also rode streetcars here in Lincoln.
Well, when I was a kid, and this would be in the early 1940s, we'd go down to 27th and J Street in Lincoln, going to go downtown Lincoln for whatever kids would do, the 7, 8-year-old kids. And the nicest guy, we'd get there a little early, and he would always pick us up and take us out to the end of the, it turned out to be the College View line. We'd go out there, and he'd have to move the trolley over and change the few things around so the car would go in the other direction. And we'd ride then downtown with him, and just the nicest fellow, especially when it was cold outdoors. And we got very used to it. It was a very nice system. It was clean. It was, can't say enough nice about it.
That's good. Interestingly enough, as we'll learn later on, the College View line was one of the last 2 lines to operate in Lincoln. And there was a reason for that. The College View line and the Randolph line were kept in service because World War II broke out. They knew there was going to be a huge shortage of gasoline and tires. And so the federal government had a regulation that if you had a streetcar system in operation, you could not abandon it during the course of the war. So those 2 lines survived during World War II, and boy, within a matter of days from the date that the Japanese surrendered, there were buses replacing the streetcars on those 2 lines. I don't know if any of you ever go down to New Orleans, but there's a famous streetcar line down there called the St. Charles line. It reminds you a lot of the Sheridan Boulevard line. It goes down the center median, and they have kept that line and preserved it. And it's really fun to ride that line if you ever get down that way. The Lincoln streetcar system started out as a bunch of independent companies. Usually what would happen is someone would say, we want a streetcar line from downtown Lincoln out to Belmont. So you'd have a separate street railway incorporate and build a line out there. Then you had another line that would build out to Havelock. And then you had another line that would build to College View, and so on and so forth. Gradually, as time went along, it became important to go ahead and affect some economies of scale. And so gradually, by the 1920s, we had everything folding into a company called the Lincoln Traction Company. And that was the streetcar company that was operating during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. Now, one of the problems that the streetcar companies had is that if this is a good picture that we've got up here on the screen right now, the tracks were embedded in whatever pavement there was in the street. And by city ordinance, the streetcar company had to maintain the pavement from so many feet from the outside rails through the center of the track. This became pretty expensive. And you got to remember that we're talking back in those days, all the streets were pretty much brick streets. And brick streets, even though they're pretty hardy, they do tend to get bumpy, and there's maintenance that's required. That caused the Lincoln Traction Company fairly early in the game to consider doing something a little bit different, as opposed to continuing to operate all streetcar lines. As early as the 1920s, we started seeing some of the lines that had been streetcar lines become bus lines. And that process continued. And eventually, had World War II not intervened, we probably would have been buses only by about 41 or 42. As it was, the 2 lines survived. This, let's go back to that one. This is on South 10th Street And remember I said we had a lot of four-wheel trolley cars. Well, this is one of them. If you had a big car, you'd have people entering both at the front and rear of the car. That then became a two-man car. It meant a motorman up front to operate the car and then a conductor to get the fares. With the four-wheel trolleys, the little short guys, what they were able to do is save a crewman because the only place you could get on and off was up front. And so the motorman would collect your fare. This one's been in a lot of books about the history of Lincoln. The line that went out O Street went as far as Wayuka Cemetery. And the reason for that was that Wayuka was way out on the edge of town. It certainly was not convenient to get there if you were walking or bringing your wagon. So we had a streetcar line that brought a lot of people out there to Wayuka. This is a small car. It's a single truck four-wheel car, and it's an older design car, and the line essentially ended there at Wayuka Cemetery. It didn't go any further east. Of course, there wasn't much further east in Lincoln at that point in time. We talked a little bit about the Omaha, Lincoln, and Beatrice, and in addition to their passenger operation, they also would haul freight cars. And these would be freight cars that came into Lincoln on various steam railroads, and then because the track gauge was the same, they just took an electric motor on there. Let's go back one, Bob. This is one of their early motors, and it's called the center cab, and it is, I believe, the #1. And a little bit later they went ahead and they got a slightly bigger engine, and that is #2. And we see #2 on the OL&B trackage, which ran down the middle of Y Street as far as 27th Street. Then it kind of jogged off and went along the side of the street. But the actual freight operation on the OL&B lasted longer than the passenger operation. The passenger operation kind of faded out in the 20s, but the OL&B was still serving customers, freight customers, much later in the game. You might wonder what it looked like on the inside of a streetcar, and this is indeed an interior shot. And we're at the rear end of the car and we're looking forward. And you can see the motorman would be there at the front of the car, and then we had a series of seats. There were a whole bunch of different car configurations, and we don't have time to talk about all of them, but I would say that this is a fairly typical interior of a car that ran in Lincoln. Unfortunately, all good things must come to an end. And these are pictures taken by Dick Rumboltz in 1945 at or shortly after the end of streetcar service in Lincoln. What they did was they brought all the cars down to the storage yard, and we can see the K Street power plant there in the background. We also can see a great big pile of coal, and that coal was there to fire that power plant, and that was brought to that area by regular steam railroad engines and cars, and then they just dump them there and the power plant would go through it. Then in addition to that, what you would get was you would get into a situation where you generated a lot of ash by burning the coal, and they tried to sell off that ash, and that was used for paving driveways and country roads and all sorts of different things. The terminal building. A lot of people know about the terminal building, but they don't know exactly why it is the terminal building. The reason it's the terminal building is that it was built by Lincoln Traction Company, and the purpose of that building was to serve as the hub of their streetcar operations in Lincoln. As we'll see in another picture pretty soon, the Lincoln Terminal Building had pretty much all the lines that served Lincoln going past it in one direction or another. And you can see the big sign that's up on the roof, Lincoln Traction, Light, Heat, and what's the third word?
Power.
Power, yeah. To me, it's interesting that when we get into the early part of the electric era, there weren't electric stores where you could buy electric appliances. I went back through the accounting records of the Omaha, Lincoln, and Beatrice, and quite often there'd be an entry that they would sell a case of light bulbs to a customer that was pulling power from their electric line along the track, or they'd be buying a fan or something like that. In the terminal building, the Lincoln Traction Company actually had a store, and we didn't include it in this series of pictures, but what it did was it had fans, it had electric washing machines, it had toasters, it had radios, it had all sorts of electric appliances. And gradually, of course, as electricity became more widespread and in greater use, why other stores took over that function. Notice the circle. That is the dispatcher's office for the streetcars. And that little bay window is still there on the north side of the terminal building. What happened was the dispatcher would sit in that office and he would watch up and down the street. Let's go to the next slide. Let's go to the next slide. As I said, all the streetcar lines kind of hub there at 10th and O Street. And here we see a couple of cars that one is making the turn and the other one apparently is going to go straight through. We're up a lot higher than the dispatcher would be, but that's sort of his view that he would have out his window. And he sat up there at a desk, and when he'd see a streetcar coming down the street and know that he had to change the crew, he'd get on the telephone. The crewmen's lockers were in the basement of the terminal building, and they'd be down there playing cards, eating lunch, doing whatever. And he would get on the phone and he'd say, "Conductor Smith, Motorman Jones, your car is just coming down O Street. You better get out there." And that's the way they would dispatch the crews at the terminal building. One of my favorite places, Sheridan Boulevard. Sheridan Boulevard, interestingly enough, the line to College View was heavily subsidized by Woods Brothers Realty. That's because they were developing lots out in that area. And this was a big sell if you could have a house that's on Sheridan Boulevard and step onto the streetcar to go downtown. The line to College View was essentially a single track line. However, there would be more than one car on the line at the same time, so we had to have provision for the two cars to pass each other. So we are east of 33rd Street, we're looking westward, and here we have two cars, one of which is on the passing siding and the other of which is on the main line. And the two cars are meeting. Well, O Street at 27th and O looks a lot different today than it did back then. In Lincoln, if you read enough of Jim McKee, you'll know that sometimes when we would put subdivisions together or incorporate towns, the streets wouldn't line up exactly. And this is an example of it. What we have is we have O Street east of 27th Street being at kind of an offset or a stagger to O Street to the west. So we're doing a little bit of a jog. The track that's going down O Street is that line that went out to Wayuka Cemetery. The line that's headed left is going down 27th Street, and it'll be one of those lines that'll be going on out to Havelock or University Place or one of those places. O Street from this point west was double track all the way downtown, so you didn't have to worry about cars meeting and passing each other. But from this point on, then you had to worry about cars meeting each other. Go ahead. I'd like to think, you know, that that this sort of thing doesn't still happen, but we know it's going to. And yes, the snowstorms did go ahead, and they did affect the streetcars. So what we have is we have this first car, and he's plowing, but he doesn't have enough power to plow the snow out of the way. So he's come to a stop. And so a second car came up behind him. They hooked the two cars together. They probably backed up a little bit, made a run for it, and here we go. And the two cars working in partnership went ahead and pushed the snow off the track. Can we go back one?
Sure.
In these various views that we see out in this area, we're going right down the middle of Sheridan Boulevard. But notice that at this point in time, you don't see a lot of houses or development out in there. We're out in the country. College View was definitely separated from Lincoln by a lot of open space. This is
Okay, there we go.
okay. This is a picture that shows again the problem of snow in the streetcar lines. At some point in time, they would have enough labor and people to go ahead and get the tracks clear and be able to run the streetcars. Of course, it helped if the snow happened in the middle of the night and you could get your crew out early and get things scooped off. One of the things that we need to remember about streetcar operation in Lincoln is that all the streetcar lines, with the exception of one, ran in the middle of the street. This meant that you had noticed the people standing there waiting for the streetcar. They had to walk out in the middle of traffic to get on and off the cars. This could be a problem. Well, not only do we have streetcars running in normal service, but State Fair always brought a bunch of people to town. And there was a special terminal at the Nebraska State Fair. And the streetcars would go ahead and run into that terminal building and drop off and pick up people. And this, as you can see, is that terminal, and it was very clearly marked. You can tell from the period address that we're talking about a number of years back. Now, Union College. Union College was built here in Lincoln partly because the developers that sold them the land and promised to get them started here, those developers went ahead and said, we will build you a streetcar line from downtown Lincoln out to Union College in College View. So that's how we have the College View line. We're looking along 48th Street. We're in the 1890s, and there's one of those little short single truck burning cars. Before this line was put in, there were some builders that built a separate line, And that line went on 27th Street down to where the old St. Thomas Orphanage was, Bishop Heights, and then it went east on Prescott Street. And that line, unfortunately, had a lot of up and down to it. And they had the inaugural run. They put 2 or 3 or 4 cars on there, loaded them up with people. They got out and were trying to climb the hill up Prescott Street, and the power plant at Union College didn't have enough power, and so the cars stalled, and the people had to get off and push the cars up the hill. That line was abandoned, and the College View line was substituted for it. This one I really like. Look at all the elements in there. We got the horse and buggy, and we have the people at the platform. Not only were there people getting on and off at Union College, but there was some freight and baggage that was being hauled out there. But the real interesting one to me is the guy on the early motorcycle that's tooling down 48th Street and kicking up a cloud of dust.
Was that run by the traction company, this freight line?
The freight operation operated with a separate management, but they contracted with Lincoln Traction Company to provide the freight and express. Okay, Dick Rumboldt's wife Marion was a elementary teacher, and she painted a number of pictures of Lincoln streetcars. She enjoyed art when she was teaching school. Once she retired, she had time to do a little more painting. And this is one of her pictures. This particular picture is
N Street.
Is on N Street.
Yeah, the Rudge and Gunzel's on the way.
Yeah.
It's turning down 13.
Yeah, we're on N Street. We're turning onto 13th Street, and the Rudge and Gunzel department store is on our right. And
across the street's the old variety of names of movie theater that eventually burned, I think.
okay. Mm-hmm.
So we'll go to
Yeah. This is another Marion Rumboldt's painting. This one should be fairly recognizable to you. We are on 11th Street. We're looking south. We're at P Street, and that big hotel that you see above the trolley car is the Capitol Hotel. Still there. Now the downtown Y. The paintings illustrate certain car colors. A lot of the early streetcars were just kind of a dark Pullman green. Then some of the cars got this sort of a nice tan with the red belt, and then you had some cars that had sort of an orange with cream. This was a double track line. You see we have cars going both directions. Next.
the hotel on the barge is the Sam Lawrence. Some of you may remember that.
The good
and
old
it's
Sam
now another
Lawrence.
hotel, the Marriott is in the same location. That's the controversial Block 35.
This is just around the corner. Now we're looking southwest. You can see the sign of the Capitol Hotel. You can see the Sam Lawrence there. And in the corner of the Sam Lawrence, there was a bar called the Tick Tock Bar that had a neon sign, and the pendulum swung back and forth. Okay, this is something.
Well, let's ask Bruce. Bruce, what is this?
Well, I wasn't around then.
Was that around when you worked there?
Well, I never worked there. Nobody ever accused me of working there. But
What my understanding was in addition to furnishing steam heat to some of the downtown buildings, they would furnish cool air in the summer. And so this was a cooling tower, and the water would drop down through I suppose, various layers. It would cool the water. And this is, again, one of your short cars, Ford trucker. Notice the bars on the windows. The traction company had to be very concerned about personal injury. So what they would often do is put those bars up there. Some of the cars had screen, and that was to keep people from sticking their elbow out there and getting young kids to throw rocks at them or hitting a tree branch or something. I love this one. We are on 14th Street. We're looking northeast. Marion Rumboltz did a oil painting of this. I don't know who owns it. I wish I did. But that car is outbound. And not much question as to the location of that particular shot. Well, all good things come to an end. And we've heard the story about the Penny Bridge. There were at one time zone fares in Lincoln. You could ride out on the College View line as far as this bridge over the Rock Island Railroad. Once you got there, you had to get up out of your seat, put an additional penny in the fare meter to go on to College View. So it became known as the Penny Bridge. Notice that the streetcar bridge is between the two concrete street bridges. The concrete street bridges are still there. Unfortunately, the Penny Bridge is gone. This was 1945, and this was the last trip. Actually, it got to be so popular they were going to do it with just one car, and they ended up having to pull a couple more cars out of service because so many people wanted to ride the last run. This is something some of you in near Northeast Lincoln may recognize. It's still there. This was the shop building for the OL&B, and it's now a garage for Gaiman Parks, but this was where that OL&B maintained its passenger cars and its freight motors. It's at about 33rd and Y. We're looking west. Okay.
So this is the last slide and then the credits. So
Okay,
if you want to
very
open it
good.
up for questions.
I like the shot that we selected for the cover. The shot for the cover was typical. You know, there we have the motorman in uniform. He's ready to go out on his run, and it's just typical Lincoln streetcar type stuff. I think that, considering the fact that these streetcars have been gone for so long, it's been absolutely amazing to me that we've recovered as many photos and as much information as we have. So let's roll the final credits. This is Bob Kuzelka. Bob is my tech person. He's the one that helped scan in all of the photos and material, and Dee Abeka helped him. And you know, this kind of capsules the whole thing, doesn't it? We're at 10th Street. We're looking east. That old building to the right is where First National Bank is. That was the old First National Bank building, since been replaced by a much more modern building. And look what we see. We see 1, 2, 3 streetcars on O Street, and then we've got the wagon going along there. We got the person on the bicycle. We got horses, buggies.
But no autos.
No autos, no. So it really kind of is a little time capsule of stuff in Lincoln. Now, I will just not spend a lot of time on it, but I want you to be aware of it. Lincoln, as this gentleman who rode the streetcar said, had a pretty good system. What happened was General Motors started building city buses. General Motors wanted to sell more city buses, so what they did was they combined with Firestone tire and rubber, Standard Oil, and some other manufacturers that would manufacture bus parts, and they formed a holding company called National City Lines. National City Lines then proceeded to buy up a bunch of these streetcar systems and convert them to buses. And that eventually happened in Lincoln. National City Lines bought out Lincoln Traction Company, and that was it for the streetcars. There was a lawsuit filed against them for conspiracy and restraint of trade. It went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. It took years for it to be decided. They finally ruled against the consortium, but by then the damage had been done. National City Lines then continued to operate the bus system here in Lincoln for a number of years, and eventually it became for a few years Lincoln Transportation Company, and it is today StarTran. Now, we've covered a lot of territory in a very short period of time. We've got, about 10 minutes for questions. I could talk here for hours and maybe not tell you what you want to know, but please, if anybody has any questions or comments, let's hear them. Yes, sir.
I have two. The trolleys were not heated.
Some of them were, some of them weren't. In the early days, what they'd have is they'd have a kerosene-fired stove or coal-fired stove in there. In later years, the more modern cars would have heating elements in there that pulled off of the overhead electricity. So, but they were cold.
Okay, I had one more. For years, there was an old streetcar parked on about 13th and Arapahoe, just kind of off the street, and it sat there. Was that one of the actual streetcars that was, do you know what I'm talking about?
I know exactly what you're talking about. Okay, there's a chap.
It's pictured in
Is there one?
Yeah. Father Lescanic was a Catholic priest, and he and Father O'Leary or something lived together. Lescanic was a trolley car buff. He didn't get any Lincoln cars, but he was able to get the frame of a streetcar that had operated in Maryland and Virginia. He brought it back to Lincoln on a trailer, and that was his sister's house. And you see that streetcar parked there. That streetcar was donated to Union College, and periodically it is put on display for people to see.
So it still exists.
And interestingly enough, that streetcar starred in a movie, and Debbie Winger was in that movie. And they fixed the car up, painted it all up, and then it came back to Lincoln, and it's been on display, I think, a couple years ago for the 50th anniversary of Union College.
Yeah, this is while we pass this around. This is the car he's talking about, and this is the scene from the
movie with Debbie Winger.
movie.
Any other questions? Doug, back clear and back.
Thank you for the presentation. A few years ago, I heard a highway engineer say that, I asked him about why there was not an attempt made to widen the median when they built the interstates and or interstate system, and he said it was a mistake. They should have allowed room for rails to be put in. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I sure do, because that was when I first started talking about doing commuter rail between Lincoln and Omaha. I said, why can't we put it down the median of the interstate? And the answer I got from the highway engineers is that the interstate curves are too tight for rail. Now, out in California, they do that, but that's because they're building brand new. You know, it's new. But we're stuck with the interstate twisty curvy as it is, so we can't do it. Anybody else, any questions? Yes, sir, Mr. Reisdorf.
Yes. Have you done any research regarding the streetcar strike that got rather violent among the motormen?
As a matter of fact, I have dozens of articles about it, and I suspect that's going to be the subject of a forthcoming book. But yes, there was a violent streetcar strike around World War I. And of course, what happened was you had the citizens taking sides. Some of the people supported the crewmen, some of the people supported the city or the Lincoln Traction Company, and yeah, it was quite a brouhaha. Yeah, I'm on top of that one. Anybody else?
Back.
Yes, sir.
Weather affect the transmission system a lot, or?
One of the problems that you would have is if you had freezing rain, you know, ice would form on those overhead wires. And there have been instances where that got so heavy that a wire would break. They had repair cars called line cars that would have to go out and repair those lines. And those line cars typically had a big tall platform so the guys could just stand and work on the wire. So yeah, it was a problem. Periodically, just with normal use of the streetcar passing underneath those wires would begin to sag, and they'd have to jack them up a little bit. But yeah, it could be a problem.
One more.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned the Penny Bridge. How much would it cost to go from downtown to College View, including the Penny Bridge? Do you have an idea?
It wasn't that much, maybe 8 cents, 10 cents.
8 cents?
So a penny was a lot.
Well, you could buy a lot for a penny.
There may be something in the book that tells that, because we do have a chart in there on zone fares.
Okay.
And the College View line was not the only one that had zone fares. We also had some zone fares on the line that went out to Bethany, University Place, Havelock, and so on. It was a way to try to capture more revenue and to give a break to the short haul riders and get a little extra revenue from the guys who are going all the way. Okay, another interesting thing which I didn't talk about is what happens when when these streetcar lines are crossing the tracks of the steam railroads. The steam railroads didn't want to have that, and there were actual crossing wars. And what would happen is the steam railroad would park an engine and freight cars across the streetcar tracks where they tried to cross. Then the streetcar guys would come and move the stuff, and then again, that was a case that went to the Nebraska Supreme Court. Finally, the streetcar line got the right to cross the railroad tracks. Typically here in Lincoln, there were no control towers to control whether the steam train or the streetcar got to cross. The streetcar was kind of like an automobile. You know, you better look both ways and make sure the way is clear. And there's a picture in the book that shows what happened where a streetcar motorman didn't see a Union Pacific train coming, and the result. So that did happen.
Do you want to mention that the book's available?
I can't until we're done filming.
Well, we can tell them as soon as this is. Oh wait, that's right. We're waiting for the signal.
Well, One other thing that I want to do, Bob, let's go back through some of these here, and I'll tell you to stop.
Where?
Go back through them.
To which?
Just keep going.
That?
Keep
No.
going. Well, I'm not going to be able to find this real
What do you
quickly.
want?
I want a picture of the streetcar that has that basket catcher thing on the front.
Oh,
I don't know if we included one of those.
the freight one has one.
Okay. One thing that the streetcar company was always afraid of was that a streetcar would hit somebody, knock them down onto the track, and they'd be cut in two by
This
the
has it in the
streetcar.
raised position.
So what happened was they put a little basket cow catcher on there that would sweep the person off their feet, catch them in the basket before they got run over.
And this one has the basket, but it's raised up, right?
Yeah,
That's
that is correct.
Union College one.
Yeah, Union College one has a basket, but it's raised up. Okay, I
Are we
think
done
we
now?
are just about out of time.